Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. You know, the issue this year, I guess after COVID-19 has been race relations. And I've had numerous different panels with people on race relations issues following the protests in the United States. But I've also had a lot of people, including Mohamed Faki, the president and CEO of Paramount Fine Foods, talking about diversity and inclusion in Canada, as well as we've had a whole panel on the Peel Board of Education, which was deemed to be racist, and surprising to me that in Peel, the Board of Education was deemed to be racist. And so I think diversity and inclusion is an issue that maybe not as important or as topical to everyone as COVID, but probably has a more long-term impact on our society, and something we need to be very mindful of. And I reached out to, and we have on tonight Miranda McKie, who is it McKie or McKie? McKie.
McKie, actually.
McKie. Miranda McKie. Miranda McKie is an inclusions and diversity analytics consultant. She's passionate about advancing women and women of color in the workplace. She's worked on various initiatives focused on utilizing artificial intelligence capabilities to gain insights on systematic barriers that impact marginalized groups. I'm really looking forward to understanding how AI can help us in this regard. And her work has led her to becoming a recipient of Catalyst Canada's Emerging Leader Award. She also teaches people analytics at Canadian universities. Miranda McKie, welcome to our show. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you so much. So tell me, how did you come to being a diversity analytics consultant and interested in AI to understand diversity?
Yeah, good question. So my background is quite interesting, actually. I have a more kind of data background in my day-to-day now, but when I was actually in school, I studied political science, and I moved into kind of understanding data and artificial intelligence only because I really wanted to learn more and understand kind of what are the root causes to some of the problems. It's really interesting to be able to understand the theories and the concepts, but I found that wasn't really getting to the actual root causes of the problems. And it wasn't until I was able to start to utilize data where we would start to really uncover interesting trends and interesting pieces about whether it's employees or society.
Fascinating. And tell us, how does AI get involved in this?
Yeah, so I think of it as, in the workplace now, when we're thinking about understanding our customers, right? Everything is driven by artificial intelligence, unsupervised machine learning. Yet when we're trying to understand, for example, employees and issues that are impacting them, there's a bit of a lag there where we're not actually looking at using artificial intelligence capabilities to understand the unique needs at scale. Often what kind of happens will be, there's a problem, and we saw this with the Black Lives Matter movement. Everyone is trying to address inclusion and diversity issues, and they pick that one, marginalized employee, that one Black employee, and ask them to tell them, what's wrong with the issue, what's going on, how do we fix it? Now, what artificial intelligence is able to do is starting to understand the unique needs of employees at scale. So you're now able to not just pick one solution and apply it to your whole population, but pick solutions that are unique and able to address multiple causes, similar to how we address, customers. I mean, what I buy is different than what you buy. So why do we have the same HR, practices supporting us where, my needs will be different than yours? So it's kind of applying those concepts that we took to market from a customer perspective and now applying it to our employee base to promote I&D.
Okay, so I've got a disconnect here. So you started out in political science in university, that's correct?
Yes.
And then you ended up in AI for diversity. Connect the dots.
Yes. Okay.
How did that happen? That's...
Yeah, for sure. So I actually, if I give you the whole history of everything, I got into banking, actually. So one of my first jobs was writing regulatory compliance policies for data governance. So kind of boring, to be honest. And when I was in that role, I was understanding very complex data governance issues and understanding it from like more of a compliance perspective. And that just really led me to understand and teach myself how to code. So that's how I actually got into it. I was completely self-taught. And then fast forward a couple of years, I moved into different data roles where I went from master data management to data science to data architecture and engineering, and actually started going into consulting for a top tier consulting firm where I actually worked at, advising organizations on their entire global data strategies.
Fascinating. And now are you an independent consultant in diversity and inclusion?
Yes, I am.
And so now you're an independent consultant in diversity and inclusion, and using AI analytics to assess that. That's fascinating. We're going to take a break and come back more with Miranda McKie in just a minute and talk about diversity and inclusion, how important it is, what we need to do to achieve it. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Miranda McKie. She is a diversity analytics consultant, and she's got a pretty interesting background. She started in political science, and then she went into banking, and she went into governance of data, and then she worked for a big consulting company, and now she's an independent consultant, but specializing in diversity analytics, but using AI. And kind of interesting. So Miranda, let's just go way back. What is diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, for sure. So diversity and inclusion is really the concept of how you create a workforce or an environment or society that's bringing in diverse backgrounds. So whether that's, often we only talk about diversity from more than ethnicity or race perspective, but it's larger than that. It's cognitive diversity, it's age, it's socioeconomic status. It's creating an environment where people feel included, and that's where the inclusion piece comes in. Often when we talk about I&D, that tends to be the term. We only talk about inclusion and diversity, but there's a really important part there to talk about as well, which is equity. And equity is really where you're creating that leveled playing field where everyone has equal access to opportunity to truly be, included in these diverse environments.
So you're really putting sort of three levels to this: diversity, inclusion, and equity. Tell me what the difference is between diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. So diversity is really referring to the people you have at the table. So they're different backgrounds and they're different, kind of areas that they're coming from. Again, whether it's from a race, ethnicity, knowledge perspective. And inclusion is the environment that you create so that they're able to voice their opinions, voice their concerns, and do that on an equal basis.
Okay. So I don't know if you like this analogy or not, but the way it was described to me, one is diversity is being asked to the dance and inclusion is being asked to dance. And equity is being asked to lead in the dance.
Yeah, that works.
Okay. So what is diversity and inclusion analytics?
Yeah. So it's the kind of the concept of now, as I was speaking about earlier, kind of how we apply advanced analytics techniques to concepts of inclusion and diversity. So if we were taking, corporate Canada as an example in the workplace, it's sort of how we now start to use techniques like artificial intelligence, unsupervised machine learning to actually understand the problem and start to make decisions on I&D at scale. So it may be using things like, similar to imagine market segmentation, where you're looking to understand a customer needs. You can now apply that to an employee basis. So it's really taking, the traditional concepts of analytics, and then now applying it to the concept of inclusion and diversity. And what's so powerful is that, even a couple of years ago, we just didn't even have that data available to make those decisions about employees. And now we do. We have proper controls and data privacy measures in place where we can actually now understand our employee population at scale.
Is that being done anywhere today?
Yeah, for sure. Organizations, especially with all of the new movements with Black Lives Matter, with COVID, there's been a huge push to understand employees using this in this way.
What's happening in Canada versus the United States in this regard?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I would say I find from the Canadian perspective versus the US perspective, perspective, often what we try to do is kind of adopt a lot of the US practices and then now apply it to Canada. So what we're seeing more in Canada is, a huge push to get more access to data. So in the US, for example, they had from their Employment Equity Act, a piece on affirmative action where they would actually collect data about employees. And now in Canada, we didn't have that. What was happening in the US was essentially that employees would they were starting to create quotas, right? So if you had, a quota for 10% of your employee population can be Black. If there was, 15% that were qualified, they weren't getting those jobs. So Canada actually didn't apply those areas there. They said, let's not collect that data. So now Canada has a push to get data in that area, but because we have stronger practices around inclusion and diversity and setting up a stronger framework, we're able to do that without limiting the actual growth of employees in the same way that the US had done.
What are some of the highest priorities that you think corporate Canada should be working on in this regard?
Yeah, obviously getting more data. I think that, that's a huge piece there in terms of, yes, they have the data, but making sure that they have enough to be able to analyze it and be able to apply it at scale. And I think it's also really important to start bringing more accountability for leaders. So what we're kind of seeing now is that, it's great in the history of, I&D, you have unconscious bias training. That's fantastic, right? And
all right, what's that? What is unconscious bias training?
Yeah, so it's kind of where you're starting to understand what some of the biases you may have. Maybe it's about a type of people or a group of people. And then they essentially will do corporate training initiatives to train you on some of these biases so that you don't apply them, right? So that you no longer are doing things like microaggressions or pieces like that to maybe marginalized communities in your workplace. And so those things and those initiatives are great, but when we're looking at really making change in organizations, one thing that we really need to do is start holding leadership more accountable. So where it's great to do these kind of training initiatives, but unfortunately mindsets don't change overnight. So how do we as corporate Canada create policies, create processes in place that are holding leadership more accountable to be more inclusive in their workplace?
How do you think corporate Canada is doing so far?
I like to be optimistic. I think okay. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. It's unfortunately with everything that happened, this year with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, it's been putting a lot of pressure on organizations to do better. So they've recognized that what they were doing, over the past years just isn't working, and they need to address these issues. So I think that's been positive, and they've recognized the needs to improvement, but we need to keep going and to keep moving.
So, back in May, June, race relations was a major issue in Canada. It seems to have died down a little bit. Defund the police was something that people talked about in Minneapolis, and then people backtracked. And it's interesting, some of the sort of the Democratic pundits that I've been listening to in the United States have said that the focus by the progressive wing of the Democratic Party on defund the police and Black Lives Matter may have actually turned some of the down ballot people away from voting Democratic. So my question to you is, were those the right strategies or the wrong strategies?
That's hard to say. I think, and that kind of goes back to your earlier question around the difference between the US and Canada. One thing that's important to notice too with our difference is that racism is an ideology, right? It's founded on beliefs, assumptions, and that's how it's manifested by how a country is governed. So what works for the US and what works for Canada is completely different, right? The US just has a completely different governing body and structure as opposed to Canada. Now, to say that, what they did was right or wrong is kind of hard to say if that would actually work for Canada. And I don't know if you've heard the concept of kind of democratic racism. it's where we have kind of in Canada, and that's what you see where the main difference from the US, it's where we have kind of two sets of conflicting views, where we believe, for example, in, multiculturalism and, kind of bringing people into the country. But then at the same time, we have these sort of racist ideologies that are kind of institutionalized and embedded. And that's a little bit different. That's a unique problem to Canada. Whereas in the US, you have more areas of overt racism, where it's more in your face, it's more police brutality, and pieces like that. So to say that, what they did in the US would necessarily work for Canada is kind of difficult.
Why do you say racism is an ideology?
Because it's a set of beliefs and assumptions. It's something that we learn. It's something that we've grown up on, right? If you ask a child to, tell you a stereotype, they get that stereotype because of how they've learned in society, right? There's been studies, for example, where kids, especially girls, they're asked to draw their vision of a scientist at a very young age before they go to school, equal female, male. When they get to school and once they're socialized, I don't quote me on the actual stat, but the majority of them draw that the scientist is a man, right? So we're socializing people into these types of ideologies based on how our society is constructed.
Really fascinating. And democratic racism, you explained, is what we have in Canada, and you're saying it's because we voice this desire for multiculturalism and immigration, but then what, we don't live up to our ideology, our stated ideology?
Yeah, and it's not that we don't always live up to it. It's just that we have these conflicting views. So for example, we, like I said, pride ourselves on multiculturalism, but then when people come to this country, it's difficult for them to get a job because they don't have Canadian experience. Right. So it's a conflicting view there, right? We're saying, come to your country, come to this country, but, when you do, if you don't have Canadian experience, you're probably not going to get that job, as opposed to, where we're saying we pride ourselves in having people come in and then we help support them 100% in the way to get that job. So that's where you're kind of seeing those opposing views.
Have you ever been subjected to racism?
I have. Of course, I've experienced everything from at a young age to, even just the small microaggressions of people being surprised that my, dad has a job and mixed and, and he's, has a career and he's a loving parent that's at home, to, being in an office situation and being confused as, the waitress while I'm the one, giving the presentation or the keynote. So, there's these kind of areas within, our lives that we get these experiences, and it's difficult and it's hard to kind of overcome them. But once you do.
What is a microaggression?
Sorry, I lost you there. Sorry about that. So a microaggression is kind of these small forms of racism that tends to be subtle. So for example, it may be something like where a man tells a woman to smile more, right? Or,
That's a microaggression.
Yes, yeah.
Really?
In certain contexts, right? Or, where, you're told you shouldn't be, wearing that outfit or something along the lines of that. So it's very small, very subtle. And why they're so impactful is because, you're going through them on a daily basis. So, the saying, like the what is it, the needle that breaks the camel's back or whatever, it's kind of that, right? It's every day you're getting these experiences of small comments, small things that are made to you. And in context, we're talking to say, you need to smile more, not a big deal, right? But when it's happening to you every day and it's always a comment on, something about how you dress, how you look, how you convey your messaging, it kind of eats away at you. And those are why they, from a long-term perspective, have such an impact on different communities and marginalized groups.
How do we rid ourselves in society of microaggressions?
Yeah, good question. I think it's on education, right? I think I was talking to my mom about it, and she made a comment that was, maybe what I would say is inappropriate or what I would say isn't politically correct. And she goes, well, I didn't mean to do it. It's like, how do I don't know everything, right? And I think it's like and to her point, I think that's fair, right? Like she doesn't know that it was inappropriate to say, but when I told her that that comment was inappropriate, it's how you respond, right? If she continues to go do that and say that, and isn't understanding the context of why it's not appropriate or why it may hurt someone else if you say that, that's where I think, that learning comes in. It's important to just not to, be like, oh, Miranda said you can't say that, so I'm never going to say it again, but I don't really understand why that hurts a group of people or why that's causing a problem. That's where, it's not really going to help everyone. But if you're like, oh, she said, that offended her and this is why, now I understand it. So now I'm not going to say it because it could have a downstream impact from that kind of microaggression perspective.
When I interviewed a bunch of people back in the spring and early summer in regards to the race relations issues, both in Canada and the United States, we talked about institutionalized racism in Canada, and that several of my panelists believed that it existed, and that some people were held back. And they talked about I had actually a trustee from the Peel School Board that talked about how some Black students were told they couldn't be ambitious, couldn't think about being doctors, couldn't think about being professors, had to lower their expectations, that they were streamed in elementary school and early years in high school to go into the technical stream of education rather than the regular. And then we also talked about others that succeeded dramatically, even against barriers. You obviously have seemed to have been extremely successful. What was the secret to your success?
Oh, that's hard to say. And I think, again, what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for someone else. But I was lucky to have, a strong environment, to have sponsors and mentors that helped guide me and navigate my career. And I think that's really what, kind of helped support me. I always say that it's kind of like having or what I found helpful, it's kind of like having a board of directors, but for yourself. Right? Someone that you can go to that can give you different perspectives, different advice on different topics, that will challenge you and not just, kind of agree to everything you say. And I think that having that kind of set up for me, whether it was family or, professionals, really helped guide my career.
We're chatting tonight with Miranda McKie, a diversity and inclusion analyst, using AI and databases and machine learning to understand diversity and inclusion issues far better than we have in the past. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Miranda in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with Miranda McKie, diversity and inclusion analytics consultant. We're talking about diversity and inclusion and equity, and we're talking about race relations, and we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and we're talking about systematic racism, and it's been a really interesting conversation. And I've learned quite a bit in regards to how we can better use analytics for understanding diversity and inclusion issues in Canada. Maybe, Miranda, you could give us some examples of Canadian companies and organizations and how they're making use of this.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing that I've seen that I was very impressed with, and I've actually done work with this organization in the past, but it was a Canadian academic institution that used unsupervised machine learning to understand why women were not going into STEM programs, so STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math. And they actually looked at 10 years of trending data to essentially understand some of the unique needs of students. So using, not to get too technical, but using unsupervised machine learning techniques, they're able to actually segment their students and identify almost before it happens where students are going to kind of drop out of STEM programs. And then that allowed them to create specific intervention points to help address those students and support them. So it was a really interesting use case because—
Okay, hold on. Explain unsupervised machine learning to me.
Yeah, for sure. So unsupervised machine learning is kind of the concept where you're letting the data tell you the answer. So I'll give you an example. So do you know kind of the concept of marketing segmentation? So for example, you'll develop like a persona to say, this persona buys, this persona is ages 18 to 20, and she buys Apple products only and shops at these stores, kind of thing, right?
Okay.
So traditionally, those kind of personas were done by, a marketing person thinking of what that persona would be. Now, as we move into this new era with data, we're able to put in all of the inputs we have about data, about that person. So everything from their buying patterns to their, where they went, location, et cetera, et cetera. And instead of someone from marketing kind of, doing that, we're able to let the algorithm almost cluster, so different kind of groups of people, and say that this is actually your persona and this is what that person likes. So we're able to get much more specific in who we direct. So that's currently being done right now in marketing, right? Most
and you're
organizations
applying it now to workforces to understand, or to students, and to understand when something will happen that they'll drop out of a STEM program.
Exactly. So it's like using data almost on the opposite way for good, right? To understand how can we use data to now understand how we can help these students better. So what that would do would be able to say, okay, we're noticing an issue where something's coming up with this unique group of people. Now, how can we release more, called student success, individuals to help these students, or career counselors to help them? Or how can we look at, their academics to help support them more? So we get to address the issue before it happens. So they can be much more proactive about it.
Okay. So you've got these artificial intelligence, what do you call them? Programs or whatnot?
Algorithms.
Algorithms, okay,
models.
or these unsupervised machine learning algorithms that determine that a whole bunch of people within a certain minority group end up leaving a STEM program at a certain time. Then what do you do with it? You've got to. This is no longer artificial intelligence. This is, you actually have to do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You maintain it, and you're able to now use that to be able to make recommendations and support those people. Right. So it's not just, you do it, it's cool, it's a nice project, and that's it. It's now, how do we make, institutional changes based on now the facts that we have from the data to help these people.
But what you're saying is, what you bring them is counseling and mentors and coaches and things like that. That sounds like the solution to the problem, correct?
Exactly.
So why don't we just do that to start with? Why do we need the artificial intelligence and the unsupervised machine learning? If people need mentors and people need counselors, let's give people mentors and counselors.
But what we're able to do with that is get more specific about the problem. So I'll give you an example. One thing, when we were looking at the data revealed, there was a thought always that having more female professors would result in more of a positive correlation to student success, female student success. So they perform better in class if there's female professors, right? So academic organizations have done huge pushes to get more female professors. Now, from our analysis, right, like there wasn't an actual correlation with that, which is interesting. So what's happening now is organizations are spending a lot of money thinking that they know the problem and the root cause, without actually knowing the problem and the root cause. So what data can help do is identify that problem, be much more specific. So then when you're implementing all of these solutions, it's cost effective, and it's
okay. So you're saying that female students aren't motivated by having female professors?
That was one of the results. Yeah.
Really? Why?
There was no correlation with the data, right, that we were seeing. So if you looked at, for example, from a grade perspective, there was no actual correlation of females performing better if there was a female professor.
So it's interesting because, and I have no idea whether it's the similar study that you did, but Harvard Business School did a study on female success in Harvard Business School, and they found that the female professors were as sexist, if at times even more sexist, than the male professors, and tended to call on males far more often than on females, even when females had their hands up.
Interesting. Yeah. Sadly, it doesn't completely surprise me. But
why? Why is that not shocking? That should be shocking. Why would females be as sexist
I think we have
as males, if not even more sexist?
Yeah, I think we have this notion that, which I think it should be, right? That you help people, like, especially one that has gone through the similar experiences, that you would help them. But unfortunately, it's not true. I mean, even my experiences, I've had the opportunity to work with some great people, but some of my worst bosses have been women, right? Some of my best bosses have been men. So, and it's kind of like, why? You wouldn't think that would happen, but unfortunately it does. So
So
that's
one
why I
of the
think that there's
answers
something.
in Peel, supposedly, to Black students not doing well is to hire a whole bunch more Black teachers. What you're saying
Yeah.
is that might not be the solution.
Well, yeah, or maybe how do we test it? How do we actually understand if that's one of the root causes to the problem? Are there multiple factors that are impacting it? I find what often happens, especially with IND solutions, is we say, yeah, that's it. That's the one answer. And then it just becomes a band-aid solution as opposed to an actual long-term fix and solution. So that
Okay,
may
so
be,
when Trudeau made his cabinet year and a half ago, he made a big deal of 50% female, 50% male. And when asked why, he said, well, it's what was it, 2018 or something like that.
yeah,
And what we're hearing right now in all the press in the United States, Biden talking about his cabinet's going to look like America, and it's male, female, Hispanic, African American, etc. Is that make sense, or does that not make any difference?
I think that makes sense. I think that it makes sense to have especially from a political, any organization that's serving a community, to have it look like the community that it's serving. When we're thinking about bringing innovative ideas to the table, we need to make sure that those people are, represented. Um, I think, though, also there's that, misconception that one, whether it's that one marginalized person, that one female speaks for everyone, right? Often that's what kind of happens in those groups. And again, it kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier, is what works for me doesn't necessarily work for you. So even if we are bringing diverse people to the table to make those decisions, it's important that those diverse people are still educated on those topics, right? And they're not just making decisions based on their own assumptions that impacted their own life.
Okay, so you've given us this one example of how um, artificial intelligence, or what do you call it, unsupervised machine learning, found out that students that were in STEM actually weren't positively impacted necessarily by having female professors, still departed. What else? Can you give me another example of how people are using this analytics?
Yeah, we've done other work too, where I don't know if you've heard of the concept of natural language processing, which is where you kind of use artificial intelligence and AI to scrape text, essentially, and then determine, keywords, and understand how it relates. So we did some work as well where we looked at using that to scrape social listening sites and understand mental health sentiment. So how specific groups of people were rating mental health, whether it was positive or negative. And what this allowed the organization to do was identify people that weren't necessarily going to their wellness centers or getting help, and identify kind of, okay, there's actually a problem here, right? And this was actually at another academic institution, and they were able to kind of identify, okay, so we have this group of people that are coming to the wellness center on this specific issue, but there's a whole new topic that's emerging on social listening sites.
I don't understand. So machine learning is listening into the social listening sites, to the social media sites, and determining how people's attitudes toward mental health is different.
Yeah, it looks at the sentiment towards it. So for example, if they have a statement like, I had a really bad experience in my math class, and I, don't feel good about it. Let's say that was the post. What that's showing you now is that's a negative sentiment towards mental health, versus I love my math class and it was great, and I'm going to tell all my family and friends about it. That's a positive correlation to mental health. So when you're developing these pieces, it's not just us, kind of developing it. You're working with psychologists, you're working with educators to kind of classify what really is truly positive sentiment towards mental health versus negative sentiment towards mental health. And then you can now, again, at scale, kind of see some of those issues and identify, where are, for example, students really posting negative pieces around mental health, and what do we have to address? Again, being more proactive about it.
So in, several of your examples, you've talked about at scale, you've talked about machine learning, you've talked about, understanding all the students at an institution, et cetera. And really what you're doing is you're accessing their comments in social media, their failures or their changes in their courses as they drop out of STEM. And I presume lots of other decisions that they make in academic life and regular life. And you're talking about companies accessing this kind of data to understand diversity and inclusion issues.
So sorry, I guess not exactly companies accessing that. So that was done as their own organization. So a company that would not be something that would be sold to a company in any way. That's for them to understand their own needs and their own.
But within that company, understanding all the employees and issues within the companies. And so I guess I've got to ask you, are you concerned about, this whole big brother kind of attitude about, the data or personal data being so well known to people like you that are going to access it to understand us better than we understand ourselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's always a concern with AI, right? And it's so important that the proper ethics and controls are put in place from every aspect of that. So for example, when those examples I've explained to you, they're anonymized, right? So that you're, making sure that users or that employee or student's privacy is being protected, and that only the people that need to know that identification, if needed, is actually provided that. And then there's now, for example, organizations have started setting up what they call AI Center of Excellence. So you're starting to see this in some HR departments where it's teams of ethics professionals, lawyers, HR professionals that now make decisions about how you're going to use the data to make sure that you're not making, because the issue is, right, you're now making decisions at scale. Right. So if, you're biased, if if it's unethical, it has a much larger impact than before when you were just impacting the one person. So it's so important for organizations to have proper ethics boards set up. And I think similarly, governments as well need to move fast with technology and understanding these issues so that they can produce proper regulation to ensure that people's privacy is protected.
We're chatting tonight with Miranda McKie, a diversity and inclusion analytics consultant, about diversity and inclusion and using unsupervised machine learning and artificial intelligence to better understand diversity and inclusion issues in Canadian companies. And it's fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight, and it's been an interesting conversation with Miranda McKie, who is a diversity and inclusion analytics consultant. She uses unsupervised machine learning and artificial intelligence to understand us better, particularly relative to diversity and inclusion issues. So, Miranda, is this a solution for Canadian companies?
I think so. I think it is. I think if more organizations really do start to use data to understand inclusion and diversity issues, we'll start to see progress much, much quicker.
And you think diversity or lack of diversity and racism are an issue in Canadian companies today?
Oh, for sure.
To be addressed.
For sure. And I think, we always compare ourselves again to the US, which is overt and in your face. And we're always like, oh, well, we're Canada, so it's so much better over here. But we're not taking into account some of those institutional systemic problems that are causing, very, very downstream, negative downstream impacts for marginalized groups.
And how do you solve that? Number one, you're going to try to do that by understanding when the issues occur through your data analytics. And you've identified a couple of times where I guess some marginalized groups feel that they can't go forward in counseling and mentorship and stuff like that to help. And education certainly helps. What else helps?
Yeah, yeah, and I think holding leadership accountable, right? So understanding that, I think we hear all the time inclusion and diversity helps business performance, but I think organizations really do struggle with finding that alignment, right? Saying that, okay, having a happy employee, how much value does that actually have on business growth? We're still not there yet in actually defining that alignment. So until a leader has a decision to make and say, I can either invest in, this customer strategy, or I can invest in my employee. And if we're unable to indicate how much that investment in an employee will help on business growth, I think we're not going to be able to make that progress there, because they're always going to pick, from an investment perspective, where they're going to make the most money. So I think as organizations, we need to also start showing that value, that inclusion and diversity isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart business decision to do.
And I think it was interesting that you identified that the diversity that we need is not just male, female. It's not just black and white. It is socioeconomic.
Yes.
It is
Cognitive.
What do you mean by cognitive?
Yeah. So often, I found this all the time in organizations I was working with, where you have recruitment schools, right? You're hiring in people that all went to the same university. So yes, they're diverse. Maybe they come from different backgrounds and racial backgrounds, which is great. But if they're all educated the same, you're not really getting diversity there from a cognitive perspective. Right. And if we truly want innovation in our firms and within our organizations, we need to bring in people that are going to think differently and challenge a specific perspective. So I think, even with me, when I was leading teams in consulting, one thing I love to do is bring in, the engineers with the art students and have them collaborate, because how they think about solving a problem is completely different, as opposed to just hiring the same type of person. And if we're trying to innovate for clients, for our customers, that's how you need to do it. You need to have that cognitive diversity there to truly foster innovation.
So there's an interesting concept in academic research in regards to social capital that you may be aware of, and that there's three different types of social capital. One is bonding social capital, which is the tight bonds with people that are very similar to you. Bridging social capital, which is that you've got relationships and friendships and associations with people that are different than you, whether they be different sexes, different languages, different races, different geographies, et cetera. And then linking social capital, which is to sort of the different levels in society. And it's often been thought about as being, people that are in business should know people in government and people in education, so that you link between sort of different parts of society. And I think that sort of is consistent with what you're talking about of the need for diversity.
Exactly. And I love the last point you made around linking, different groups, from whether it's government to corporations to education. I always found that interesting as an example, like, academics. They're producing such great research on these topics, right? And they're producing journals. They figured it out a lot of the time. They dedicate their lives to these specific areas, yet organizations aren't even accessing, some of these academic journals that are discussing these issues in detail, which is just a very interesting divide, right? Why aren't we bringing academics and corporate together to solve some of these problems, as opposed to just them doing their own thing and them doing their own thing? So completely agree with that.
Well, Melissa, Miranda McKie, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you educating us on unsupervised machine learning and artificial intelligence, and applying it to diversity and inclusion. And I loved your comment about diversity, inclusion, and equality. And so maybe I'll end with one comment that I heard, that diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice, and equality is a vision to aspire to.
Thank you so much.
Well, that's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. You can get me every night at 9:60 a.m. at 6 o'clock p.m. You can also stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can get all my podcasts and video casts after the fact on my website, briancrombie.com. Have a great evening, everyone. And Miranda McKie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.